Okay, let's go. Let's see if I can bring this up. Thank you for being here. As I'm bringing this up, let me let you know that I was able to see Adrian and Brian's presentations. And so the real quick beginnings is that I grew up in East LA, very much a person who was involved with friends with the Chicano walkouts, the blowouts that took place.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, so that's sort of my background. And then I lived in Claremont for a while, and then I lived in Riverside for a while. And then I moved with my second husband to Pasadena and finished up my MA in music history. So technically, I'm a musicologist and lived here for 15 years before I ever knew there was any history of Latinos in Pasadena because I live in North Pasadena. And quite frankly, a lot of my life was circled around St. Mark's, which is where I met some of you. That was my world, Altadena Hardware, St. Mark's, going up into the foothills. And on occasion, if we didn't pay our gas bills in time, I would go down to City Hall. And that was primarily my interaction with City Hall and the city of Pasadena. Um, my husband James and I were really thrilled when we moved here. And I remember our dining room essentially being empty, aside from the yellow pages and the directory that we found. And we were very excited to see that a Black woman was the mayor of the city of Pasadena. Loretta Glickman was mayor at that time. And so my perceptions of Pasadena were very much sort of whatever it was that I read in the newspaper, in the Star News. And very much of what was printed as far as community, different affinity groups went, was stories about the Black community. So I had no idea for 15 years that the Latino community had any history here in Pasadena. Through a series of events, I began to become involved in the community and began to meet some of the elders who were here and began to hear some of their stories. Um, Out of that came the Latino Heritage Parade, as it's now known. And out of that actually came small talks and lectures that eventually became the book, Latinos in Pasadena. I was astounded to learn how much history was here. Some of the history that was in many ways similar to what I knew in East LA, and some that was very unique and particular to Pasadena experiences. And at the prodding of one of my community members, uh, I ended up writing the book, Latinos in Pasadena. And what I did was I talked with the elders. Because they knew me, they shared photos with me. Because of my academic training, I was able to go to places like the Huntington and the Pasadena Museum of History and look at the images that were there and get kind of a more objective kind of sense of Pasadena because I wasn't from here. I didn't grow up here. I didn't grow up with assumptions about what Pasadena might be like. Part of it was informed by the more scholarly kinds of experiences I'd had, and part of it was informed by the people who had been here. And so, what you're going to be seeing this morning is a rather encyclopedic kind of dashing through in chronological, but not exact chronological order of many of the experiences of the Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, Latine in Pasadena, because we're all here and our experiences, like every other community, are broad. So let's see how I can get us up here. Can everybody see this?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, well then obviously I'm not doing something right.
You have to say share screen, and then it gives you a panel of things that you can share, and you just want to pick the one in the upper left corner that says share screen and click on that, and then select the share button in the lower right.
Okay,
And
we'll
that
get there.
it up.
So let's see. I've gone
You
to
can
share
also
screen.
double click on the share screen image in the upper left corner, and that should do it too. If you double click your mouse there. There you go.
There you
Now
go.
we're
Okay.
sharing.
Okay, here we go. And now what I'm going to do is hopefully this. There we go.
Oh no. Ah,
That's
come
okay.
back.
No, we'll get it. We'll get it. Don't worry about it. I'll just keep vamping. Don't worry. There's lots of photos. So we will get there. It may take us a moment. There we go. Now we could go in backwards order too, I guess. So you, I'm going to ask you just kind of hold on, and here we'll start at the beginning. This should fill it up. Yay. Okay. So we have the date. So far, so good. Now I like to begin every talk that I give with sort of a land acknowledgement, because what we need to remember as we're looking at all of these images from any of the affinity groups that are coming here is that there were people here already when we came when we migrated and immigrated, whether it was from Europe, Asia, Africa, South America. There were folks that were here. The Tonga were here. And this is a really cool map. I love the colors. This was done by Chester King User, and it's showing where different communities of the Tongva, who sometimes refer to themselves as the Kij or as Gabrielinos, lived in the area before anyone else was living in this area. And one of the things that is particularly pertinent, it's come in the news in the last few days, is living here and the people where people lived has always been about water. The story of the San Gabriel Valley, the story of the San Joaquin Valley is about water. And the Tongva, just like everyone else, these are areas that are connected,
No,
close to water.
This is something else.
Excuse me? And among the people that were here, whose names we know are a part of the history, is Toy Purina. Toy Purina was unique in that, or relatively unique, I should say. The Tongva had the practice that women could not only be chiefs, but they could also be shaman, which was rather unique. Toy Purina was living in the area, landed or began to live at the San Gabriel Mission. And because of the poor treatment she and others were receiving there at the mission, she was part of a revolt that took place, a rebellion that took place in 1785, some 14 years after the mission was established. She was brought to an informal court, and there is language that is shared there where she talks about how much she hates the priests and what they did to her people. She was banished up to San Carlos after she'd had a conversion and was married off to a man who was living at the mission in the north. She died, but I think it's important for us to remember that while there were those who came with good heart to share what they believed in Christianity and Catholicism, there were also those that imposed their culture, their language, and made the community in many ways invisible. And it's not just this one community that's had to deal with that throughout the years. When we think about the San Gabriel mission, I think it's important to this picture that was done is a beautiful drawing. The San Gabriel mission, Misión San Gabriel Arcángel, was the richest of all of the missions. Eventually, Santa Barbara may have been the queen. She was the queen at the prom, but this was the one that got the work done. This was the one where they had tallow, where they had olive trees. And much of when we're thinking about how this area begins to grow up, it's all emanating from the San Gabriel mission. There isn't a downtown Los Angeles at this point. If there is a downtown to the San Gabriel Valley in this point of time, it's around the San Gabriel Mission. And many of the people who were involved with the mission have names that you would recognize, like Pico, Pio Pico. He's going to come up in a few minutes. And one of the folks that comes up in the history of the mission is one of my favorites, Doña Eulalia Perez de Guillén de Mariner. Her story is unique, but telling as we look through all of our history going forward. And that is that she was born in the port of Loreto in Baja California. Her dad was involved with the Navy, and very pertinent here, her father taught her how to read, which was extremely rare to take place in those days. And her dates were 1766 to 1878. Again, 1766 to 1878. And think about how many parents, how many fathers are teaching their daughters how to read. And this learning how to read serves her well. In some ways, she has a very standard life because by the age of 14, she's busy dancing at dances. And by age 15, she's married and has children. Her husband is a leather coat, a leather soldier, and she follows him from Baja California to San Diego and then San Juan Capistrano, where in 1812, she's in church, huge with belly because she's pregnant. And does anybody know what happens in 1812? I'm used to being in a group here. There is the great earthquake of 1812, and that is when San Juan Capistrano, yes, San Juan Capistrano tumbles away. She's inside and she crawls out, pregnant and with one of her children. And I mention that story in part because that tells you something about the discipline and the strength that this woman has. She continues to follow her husband as he's going back and forth, and eventually becomes a widow and then follows her son to Mission San Gabriel. And she, over a 3-day cook-off, becomes the chef, becomes the head cook for Mission San Gabriel. And she's so good at what she does that she eventually becomes La Llavera, which means that she eventually has all of the keys to the mission. And she functions like the chief operating officer. She was not an aristocrat. She was a widow. One of the things that she had going for herself was that she knew how to read. And Bancroft, when he sent out people to find out about what was happening, what had happened in the California period, he sent John Savage out to interview her. And her oral history can be found online in both English and in Spanish. And if you would like to go and see that, there is a transcription in English, if that's your dominant language, and there's also her original in Spanish, if you would like to read what she actually said. She is so well revered that when missions had to give up their lands, when they were secularizing, the land of Rancho El Rincón de San Pascual is reserved for her, 14,400 acres, which all of Pasadena sits on. And the arroyo, it goes to the west side of the arroyo and then on south, and a mile into the foothills. All of this was reserved for her. Being the woman she was, she thought this was okay. The priest told her she needed to marry Mr. Perez. And so she did, but she also decided she didn't like him. So she left him. And she went back to be with her kids by the San Gabriel Mission. People that lived in the area that we'll hear about later, folks like Lucky Baldwin, knew about her and would bring people to meet her. She was a sort of curandera, which is an herbalist. And she also was a partera. She was there at the birth of folks like Pio Pico. She was well known for the skills that she had and held in very, very high regard by those who knew her or knew of her. One of the things that sometimes gets lost when we talk about the changes that happen in this area is we know about the effects that take place and some of the implications that are a result of the US Civil War. But we forget that there was a US Mexican War that took place in the late 1840s, before the state of California became the state of California in 1850. And some of what is woven throughout the history of the community here is the impact, um, sometimes very specific, sometimes in more tacit sorts of ways, of the fact that the US won the war and Mexico lost the war. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was a point of contention and was not followed, so that people who had been Mexicanos who owned land, many of them had to prove that they owned the land, as opposed to happens more frequently in our period, where people who are claiming the land have to prove that they have a right to the land. So her husband dies. She's off at the mission. There's a couple of exchanges of hands of Rancho El Rincón de San Pascual, and then Manuel Garfias becomes the owner. And Manuel Garfias, many of you who have ever been to Alvera Street have seen where his mother-in-law and father-in-law lived. The Avila Adobe on Alvera Street is where his wife, Luisa Avila, that's where her family was. So there is a connection from Los Angeles here to what will become Pasadena. And one of the things that's interesting is that Manuel Garfias is the last Mexicano to own Rancho El Rincón San Pascual, and he's the first American to own San Pascual Ranch. We went backwards. We're not supposed to do that. And here's the plat for San Pascual Rancho. And you can see the word order has changed, which already began to tell you how people are thinking. They're no longer thinking in Spanish, they're beginning to think in English. And it's given to Manuel Garfias. You can see here is the arroyo, and you can see here are the mountains. And way down here is Manuel Garfias's place. So after the mission system, after the US-Mexican War, and before we came Pasadena. Here is the remnants of the Garfias Adobe, which is practically in South Pasadena. And these are images that are found in English language documents and books. And here is Pio Pico, who was the last Mexican governor of California. His Secretary of State was Juan Bandini. And this swarthy looking fellow here is Arturo Bandini. Arturo Bandini is the son and a product of the Californianos that were here. He went to Santa Clara and eventually got his master's. He's out here at San Luis Rey, and he's hanging out with his buddies, is what it is. You know, you get on your horse, there's lots of land, and you wander out to some of the places that are older, and you can see how the missions have become decrepit because they're no longer being overseen by the church. And why do I bring up Arturo Bandini? Well, in part because he remains very much a part of the San Gabriel Valley, and in particular in Pasadena. It is he who January 1st, for years and years and years, takes his buddies out for a hunt. And among those people is a Mr. Holder. And he is credited with being, by Holder, as being one of the folks that helped to start the Tournament of Roses. And among the things that happened in the earliest Tournament of Roses was they had Californiano games that were played. Some of them included a really kind of a ghastly game where you would bury a chicken and only have its head, yeah, I know, and only have its head up. And then you'd go riding on your horse and you'd grab at the chicken to pull it out of the ground. Yeah, not real
Ew.
cool. Yeah, I know. Well, there's always something bitter and always something
Yeah.
sweet about any community and any affinity group and their practices. And this was not a highlight in my book. On the other hand, there was also a game that one played while riding a horse where you would have a lance and you would try and get hoops as you were riding past the hoops. And thus was born the Tournament of Roses. So when you think about the Tournament of Roses, it has a history that goes back to some of the traditions that were practiced by the Californianos that were here. I have this image here partially, my husband in saying, I asked him to check and make sure that all of the fonts were in brown. And he said, well, that's good, honey, but this just seems weird. This was one of the very first images I saw when I was busy beginning to do research on Mexican Americans in the area. I'm not so sure that this is not a Mexicana that is here. It's entirely possible that she might have been an indigenous person. She might have been Tongva, because there were Tongva that were living in the area, in the arroyo. There's an area of the arroyo that is still referred to as Indian Flats. And often what happened with the missions is the people, when they were baptized, they were given new names. And so it's entirely possible she may have had a name that might have been similar to Toipurina's, or she may have had a name that was similar to my last name, Martinez. I don't know, but I think it's interesting to look at the diversity of what's going on. It's also important to know that when you're thinking about people that were living in the area, there were folks that were homesteaders that were Mexicanos as much as Irish, as much as a Yankee from New York that were living in the area. And often these were people that were living informally in the foothills. Now, remember I mentioned about Arturo Bandini, excuse me, it's water. Well, he and his wife, who is the daughter of Thomas Balch Eliot, who was part of the California colony of Indiana, who came here, decided after they'd been married for a while that they wanted to have a home. And so they went to these two young whippersnappers that were beginning to make a name for themselves in architecture. And so they spoke to Green and Green, and in 1903, their home, El Hogar, was built. And it is the only example that I know about of a Green and Green that has the image of the Virgen de Guadalupe in its living room. And as you can see, one of the things that the Green brothers talked about, and articles that discuss this place talk about, is how lovely it is to have the combination of both the influences that they're seeing as they're checking out what they would like to do in architecture and the influences of the Californiano that was here before. This is the first time that they're really mightily able to infuse interior and exterior. And there's a whole separate talk that I give on the house that shows that it picks up on the rancho style. Not everybody was able to interact with the Green and Green. There were lots of people that were moving here. There were things happening in Mexico. And among them, this is before the Mexican Revolution is taking place. During the Porfiriato, which is ending up in the 1890s and going towards the 1910s, there are very few people that can own land. And so folks are coming to the United States. And the United States is also looking to build up what is out here. The West is deciding that it's going to need to become more cosmopolitan. So it's looking for workers and finding workers just across the very new border is much easier than trying to bring in workers from Europe, say. And so there's a lot of interaction that's taking place. There's also the buildup of railroads that are taking place. And there are agents for the larger railroad companies that go down to Mexico into the villages and get workers. And in fact, there's a couple of stories about mayors who are really upset because people have come down and they've pretty much taken all of the young men from their village and bringing them here to the United States. And the back and forth that happens between the United States with their needs of workers, and then when when the government is feeling they don't need the workers, pushing people back to Mexico is part of a pattern that still continues. I have this picture here of the family. I don't have their name, who are on the Pasadena City sewer farm, and they're busy picking walnuts. There's a reason I believe that we do have a Walnut Street, much as we have an Orange Grove. We had a lot of agriculture going on. Here's a class at one of the schools. One of the things that was unique about Pasadena was the fact that from the get-go, there was a school district in existence before the city incorporated, and there were libraries in existence before the city incorporated. And if you look at this image of this class that's near the arroyo, you can see the diversity of who is in the different who's in this class picture. And you can see some kids are like this young woman here. I think I can see her. That's a hand-me-down. Somebody has worked at the collar, somebody has shortened this over here. These shoes have seen better days. And, you know, if you look at the kids, you can see the variety of experiences and who these kids are. Over here in this corner, I love this fellow. You know, I don't know if there's enough water or gel. They didn't have gel in those days. So his hair is just as free as can be. And of all the kids who are barefoot here, it is this who is here in the corner. So the diversity, we often also don't talk about the fact that we had working class whites that were living in this area. And often when we think about the white community and their history, we know about Millionaires Row. And we know about the people that were professionals. We don't have a lot of history that's been formally kind of put together talking about the Irish and the Greeks and the Italians and the Swedes and the Germans that were all living in this area that were immigrants. At one point, I was looking because I'd heard sort of the stories that all of the first Blacks that came here were domestics. And I knew about the Prince family. And I knew about, you know, a couple of, and many of them were entrepreneurs. So I went to find out, so who were the domestics in 1920? And as it turns out, in 1920, the largest pool of domestics were young women who were single, who were Swedish. So I think it's always interesting in looking at history to try and dig a little deeper and find out what the experiences are of the different communities. Maria Guadalupe Evangelina Lopez de Lauther was at the San Gabriel Mission. Her dad was reasonably well educated, and she graduated from Pasadena High School in 1897. There was no high school in San Gabriel in 1897. She went on to teach at USC in 1903, then went on to be involved at UCLA, doing a lot of translating, and then came back after she'd retired to San Gabriel. And a lot of the business improvements that took place there by the mission, she was involved with that. And if you ever go to the San Gabriel Mission Playhouse, You'll notice there's a low adobe on the other side of the street. That was where she lived, and it still exists. And they're still trying to figure out what they can do to preserve that. If you look at her, she's very old school. She's got her hair up, she's got the long sleeves. And I put her in contrast with these young Latinas that are here, these Mexican Americans, is how they would refer to themselves, that are flappers. They got their hair cut. You probably could see their knees when they sat down. They might have worn high heels and hose. And Maria Guadalupe in 1897 would have been horrified to see that. And they, looking at her, would have thought, oh my God, how old fashioned is that? So Pasadena is unique in that we have one of the elders I spoke with was Dave Reese. He's since passed on. And he shared that there were three different areas where Mexicanos, Mexican Americans, lived in the 1930s. And let me just real quick let you know that I'm mostly talking about Mexicanos and Mexican Americans because at that time, that was the largest group that was living here. There have always been people who were, say, from Cuba or Panama or Honduras, other countries. But at this point, the vast majority of Latinos, Latine, and Latinx that were here were Mexican and Mexican Americans. Here in the South Side, you find, there's Busch Gardens. I remember somebody was talking about that in one of your earlier talks. And here you have a barrio that's existing. It's existing down here, and that is one of the two places in town where we had schools that were established as segregated Mexican schools. There was a segregated Mexican school movement that was taking place across the Southwest. These were people that were living in the urban areas. When you're talking about what was going on here, people were working on the intercity railroads. People were also working at some of the factories and commercial districts that were there, along with the Greeks and the Italians and other folks that were living there. There's a great thing by Margaret Duncan Abrams that talks about the commercial area and all of the people that are living there. Up here in the Northwest, you can see the Winona Cypress area. And in that area, this was established blue collar folk that were living here. These were folks that they'd been working at the job long enough. They knew they were going to have a roof over their head. They might be saving up for a car, or they might be saving up for a second car. Irish Americans, Japanese Americans, Mexican Americans, and African Americans all were living in that area. And over to the east is the area of Chihuahuita. It was a colonia. It was very separate, lived a very separate experience from the people who are on the west side of town. And when I was first interviewing some of the elders, they would talk smack about each other. They would say, oh, those people from the west side, or oh, those people from Chihuahua. It's the rivalry we all have, Oh my goodness, turkey tussle kind of talk, I was mentioning the segregated Mexican schools. Junipero Serra was one that was on the west side of town. What was among the more unfortunate things that was a part and parcel with the school was the fact that they were figuring out that these young women, in this case, were going to grow up to be domestics. So as much as anything else, what they were going to be taught were going to be the skills that they were going to need. And they're talking about not math. They're not talking about the world at large. They're figuring out how to be domestics. And I always cringe when I see this little girl here on the stool in front of that hot pot, because I think OSHA would be horrified. The school, the Latino community continues to grow. And this is Junipero Serra School. There's over 200 students that are there. Junipero Serra was one of the two established Mexican segregated schools or segregated schools for Mexicans. The other was over in Chihuahua, and it was Chihuahua School. And they began to grow because the population grew. You know, Pasadena has had great periods of growth, great surges of growth. And this picture is taken in 1928. Junipero Serra closes in 1931 because they don't have enough students. That's happening at the same time that the deportations are taking place. And the Mexican deportations are taking place, and there's close to at least 1 million people who are Mexicanos, Mexican Americans, are sent to Mexico. 60% of whom, 60% of whom are American citizens. So you're sending people to Mexico who have no idea how to speak the language, because when you went to school here at these segregated Mexican schools, if you spoke Spanish, you were slapped. Dave Reese, who helped me with that map, told me that people would have tape put across their mouth if they spoke Spanish. You couldn't speak Spanish in the classroom. You couldn't speak Spanish in the playground. And so this population, this school that has all these kids, all of a sudden in 1931 doesn't have enough kids to keep the school open. There is nothing that I have found to this date that says specifically that was what happened, but coincidences are not always just coincidences. On a different note, here are some more pictures from the Mesa family. The guys are up around the corner near Fair Oaks. I would not mess with them, especially the tall guy. I'm betting he and the guy who is, let's see, kind of one over, maybe the leaders, because they look like they could do business. On the other hand, we have the Mesa family that are down at the Arroyo. When I shared these images with some of the students at Marshall High School, they had never been to the Arroyo. They didn't know about this. And the idea that we would have, again, the water for recreation is not something that they had experienced. And much has happened with the Black community, Latinos and Japanese and other community, other affinity groups could not go to Brookside Plunge. So going out and going to the Arroyo and messing around in the water with your family is a great thing to do. The other thing that I think is really kind of interesting about this is that if you look at this, you can see it's very much an intergenerational, it's a multi-generational experience that's taking place. It's very informal, which I think adds to the beauty of this, you know, that's here. The kids, they all know about photographs. The parents, I don't know. Mama, who's over here down here, I'm not so sure she's so thrilled about the picture. And she was maybe standing up and then, like so many of us, ducked down when the picture was going to be taken. Women at that time, it's good to remember, were still very much being directed to do womanly arts and womanly sorts of things. There was a huge social gospel movement that was taking place in the area. And among the things that came up were this idea of having cooperative laundries. So women could take the skill set that was womanly at the house and now be going out of the house, working with other women in a sort of job that wasn't such a stretch from what people would perceive they're doing at home to what they might do outside of the job. I want to always make clear that this must have been the photo day because the women look like they're kind of dressed to the nines. Yes, they are dressed up. And in this mangler, she would never wear that scarf near the mangler. There's a reason the mangler is named as it is. Stella Nunez Castro is living out on the east side of town, and Mr. Magdaleno was a union man who operated this giant machine that is part of the Arroyo Seco Parkway. So every time you're driving on the Arroyo Seco Parkway, you can now think about Mr. Magdaleno and the fact that somewhere at some layer down below, he laid what you're driving upon. Again, talking about how things are changing. We're coming into World War II. Horrified. Maria Guadalupe, these guys don't have shirts on. We're talking about how things are changing and how people are becoming much acculturated. Life is changing here, and we're near Broadway, right before World War II. I always think that some of these guys are kind of cute. I'm way too old for any of them, but if I were 19, oh my goodness. Joe Jaramillo went off. He fought in World War II, and he was among those that died in service to the United States during World War II. Natividad Vacio was among those people who his family came from El Paso. He primarily, almost exclusively spoke Spanish as a kid, so he was sent to one of those segregated Mexican schools. And eventually, in part because of the Pasadena system, the 644 system, ended up going through a couple of years of junior college and then went on and became a teacher. But while he was younger, performed in the arts. He danced, he sang, and continued to work in the area of theater and then movies up until he died. And if any of you have ever seen the Milagro Beanfield War, yes, he's one of the locos that's there with Pacheco's pig. He kept working, and part of the reason he ended up being in TV, he did a variety of things, was because his buddy, and I always get which of the Reeves it is, Steve Reeves, or was it George Reeves? That was Superman? Well, Superman on TV grew up in Chihuahua. And because he was friends with Nati, he was able to bring Nati to Hollywood. And that was how Nati got his part of the way that Nati became involved in movies here. I mentioned Pasadena Junior College and the 644 system. What that meant was that you had schools that were put together with the first 6 years, and then you went to a sort of middle section of school that was 4 years long. And then you had another 4 years, which included 2 years of junior college. And these are people who are part of the Xochimilco Club at Pasadena Junior College. And part of the reason that they're there is to help folks better understand Mexican culture. This is happening, excuse me, drink. This is happening about the same time that the Zoot Suit riots are taking place. So again, we may know about Zoot Suit riots because of the movie and Eddie Olmos and Los Angeles and East LA. But a lot of what we see that is going on in movies about Los Angeles, there are smaller experiences, smaller in number, experiences that are going on here in Pasadena. So we had Dave Reese wore his Zoot suit. Dave Reese explained to me that part of the reason the guys walked backwards on their shoes was because they would put extra soles on the bottom of their shoes that would tilt them back a little bit, so they would have ease in walking just that way and looking a little cooler. This fellow here, we're going to see again in a while. I love looking at group photos because especially with folks that are young, because there's so much about who they are that is shared in these photos. So we're going to come back to Huicho in a little bit. And this man really has not gotten his due. His name is Manuel Contreras. And he is one of the founders of Univets, coming back after World War II and being involved with the merchant marines. He starts to put together histories of the community. And these folks, because they're hanging out with each other, will gather together and share stories of what it was like coming up. He also is one of the founders, along with Marianne Montañez, of the Pasadena Mexican American History Association. And this is one of the pools from which I was able to get a lot of these pictures. He has a couple of volumes of the notes that they had at a local settlement house, the Edna P. Alter Settlement House. You can find it in the Pasadena Library. And I can share more of that information detail. Manny Contreras. This is just, some of these pictures are just cool just because they're cool. These are teens that are trying to look very cool. You can tell they probably have been in high school, because if that isn't what your yearbook kind of pose, I don't know what is. The girls down below making the wonderful framing for the folks up top. As I understand it, they had the picture outside because they couldn't go inside the Green Hotel. Church has always been very important to many of the communities that were here, and Mexican American communities no different from many others. Our Lady of Guadalupe Mission Church was at Raymond and California, approximately. The Guadalupanas are the women who were devoted to what's happening at the church and Our Lady of Guadalupe. And you can see in the 50s, look at all these women who have been living here a very long time, and are committed to just making the place look good. And making sure you can see the little bit of a fountain down here. And the next time you go to Mijares, if you enter past the bar, and then there's that sort of atrium-like room, and then there's the garden area off to the left, you will see this mural, these tiles of the Virgen of the Guadalupe that are at Mijares now. Most people don't know that. Here's Huicho, all grown up-ish. And he was the first Latino firefighter for Pasadena. And that was in 1950. I believe it was 58. I've seen something else that said 56. He served during the Korean War. These are his sisters and his mom rather, on the steps before he went. He came back, and he was charming. He was one of the community grand marshals for the Latino Heritage Parade that starts a little bit later. And when we looked about Our Lady of Guadalupe Mission Church, if you look at this picture, that's just how wide it was all the way across. It was teeny tiny. You can see the people have had to curve around because you had room for maybe one, maybe two more people here. And that was the whole of the church that was there, that all those Guadalupanas were making sure that it was looking good. There were 2 segregated schools for Mexicans in the area, and there were 2 churches for Mexicans that were in the area. 2 Catholic churches, I should say, for Mexicans in the area. Our Lady Guadalupe Mission Church and St. John the Baptist over by Chihuahuita. There was also in the area the Mexican Methodist Church that was, I'm blanking and not remembering whether or not it was on Raymond or Fair Oaks. And there was a Mexican Methodist Church that was also in Chihuahuita. And one of the things that was fun about the Mexican churches was that the Catholic kids would go to the Methodist church on Wednesday because that was when they had hot chocolate. And the Methodists would come to the Jamaicas that took place at the church because that was a fun event. So there was some go back and forth that was going on. It was not even a friendly rivalry, just good neighbors that were living in the area. First simulcast to take place of the Rose Parade was in 1952. And these are the folks that were involved with it. And somebody was watching what was happening with the parade, and then they'd be translating automatically into Spanish on the radio. We're so used to having Univision and Telemundo. We have to remember that back in the day, there wasn't any Univision. There wasn't any Telemundo. There was La Opinión for news, and that was kind of it. So the experience that folks were having here, you had to learn how to speak or know somebody in the family who could help translate. And thus we're feeling somewhat isolated and separate from because it wasn't, translation wasn't there in Spanish. This is a green card of Mr. Lopez. And down below you see Canto Robledo, who was a fighter who became blind and who initially and who eventually became the first and only, as far as I know, blind trainer for not only boxers but also for a baseball team. He's worth noting. We're bopping into the 70s now because we're going fast. And this is uniquely Pasadena. Mexicano Estudiantil Chicanos de Aztlán was a group that was all about Chicano power. And there I went into my power mode. Okay, so went into Chicano power and was very much trying to make sure that there was a place for Mexican American and Chicano students so that they didn't remain invisible, so that the needs that they had, when we think about DEI sorts of relative for today, were going to be included. What was unique about Pasadena, this is at Muir High School. These women, these young women, have sold tickets, and whoever sold the most tickets became queen of the court, right, of the Meta court. I don't know of any other mechistas anywhere who had a court that did something like that. We couldn't be in the Rose Parade. We couldn't be a part of the Rose Queen's court, but doggone if they weren't going to have a court here in Pasadena in 1973. And when I asked the elders, so what did you use the money for? Scholarships. That was one of the ways that, yeah, it wasn't the brand new car or the TV or whatever. It was for scholarships. So that was very cool. Change comes in the 60s and in the 70s. Yvette Lightfoot, who is a Puerto Rican heritage, was along with Elias Galvan. They pioneered televised Spanish lessons in California. All those little lessons that any of you might have seen that were in Spanish on TV, the idea and the practice for that started here in Pasadena. Ramon C. Cortines was here, still is here. In fact, they had something on him recently. I think the mayor said something or the other about him recently. He's still here. He's still walking around. And he was here in Pasadena, then he was in New York, then he was in Los Angeles, and then he was, he's been around. He's still here. And he was among those that were able to help bring change to the area. And someone that we don't often get to see is Filemon Gutierrez. There was a school board member who really didn't like what was happening as far as integration. In fact, the fact that it was taking place in PUSD, left. They had a seat that was open. L.B. Hickenbottom, to his credit, said, you know what, we have so many Chicanos in our school system, we should have a Chicano on the school board. And so he put forth the name of Filemon Gutierrez, who had been active in the community, to be on the school board, and Marge Wyatt, who was a white woman, very much seconded that. And so allyships can work. He was on the school board for just a short term, he left, and it was another 10 years until there was a Latino on the school board for PUSD, and that was George Padilla. By the way, in addition to the community work that Philemon had done, Phil was a barber. And so he got the scoop when people would come in for their haircuts. He knew what was going on. In the 80s, going into the 90s, we have people who, where before it had been primarily Mexican Americans and some Cubans that had been here, there were folks that were coming up from Central American countries. And so here's just a fairly informal picture of folks waiting for the bus at the corner of Fair Oaks and Howard. Where the Latino community is residing was broken up by the freeways. If you think back on the both what Adrian and Brian shared about how the freeways cut through the Black community, brown community, Asian communities were living together. And so when they went through that, they also went through these communities too. Congressman Roy Ball represented us for a long time. He was the first Mexican American on LA City Council, and that was an uphill fight. And his family members, he still has family members that are living in Pasadena. I put these two pictures here because I think it's important when we think about who has made this city who it is. It's important to not only remember the people that are the chair of the organization or the architects, but the people who are putting in the blood, sweat, and tears. There are workers that are very proud, who I had a chance to talk to, who were part of those that helped to lay the cement for City Hall. There are people that were in the CCCs that were part of making the Arroyo what it is now. These gentlemen that are here for public works are part of what keep our city as wonderful as it can be. Lincoln Elementary School, if you look at it in the 1950s, you can see this is an area, remember we were talking about the Winona Cypress area, very diverse. All of these kids, they were with each other. They were with each other in the neighborhood. They walked to school with each other. And after school, they played in each other's yards. Starting some years ago, I was a part of a group that started the Latino Heritage Parade in Jamaica. And part of what you're seeing now was part of what helped us get all these pictures together. And so this was the last year that I was able to chair this. And you can see there's Mayor Bogard and Carol Liu, Jackie Robinson, Dan Guerrero. We had in total on the truck 14 people. Don't tell anybody. The first complexity of who we are, who our backgrounds are. First, Latina Rose Queen, because we had to get back, we are in the City of Roses, is Miss Yamasaki. Okay. My gut instinct when I heard the name Yamasaki is, wait a minute. Well, dad is Japanese Peruvian. Mom is Chinese Peruvian. They came from Peru here. Our backgrounds are as diverse as the world. One of the things that's a part of Latino heritage is the idea of mestizaje, the idea that we own all our roots. We have, if I look at my ancestry.com DNA, I got me my Bantu, I have me my Berber, I have me my Basque, I have me my Indigenous, my Spanish, and that's all a part of who I am. And here is the first president of the Rose Parade, who is Latina, Laura Farber. And this is just a cool picture because these are some kids that were at that settlement house that I was talking about. And this fellow over here, his granddaughter, her doctoral thesis was studying and contrasting the segregated Mexican school that her grandfather went to and the segregated Mexican school that her father went to. Thank you. I'm done.
That's great,
Oh,
Roberta. Thank you very much.
thank you very much, Roberta.
Yeah.
All right, well, we got time, you got some time for questions then. Does anybody have some questions they'd like to ask Roberta while we've got her here?
No, I thought the presentation was great. My name is Jose Luis. I know that you saw about Contra Robledo. I used to fight for him. I knew him, and he was a great guy. And there's a lot of history that he entailed on us as fighters. And if you ever want to, there's a book written. It's called Blood on the Canvas. If you want to learn more about Canto, and there was also a documentary that was just put out. And it's about his life. They're trying to get a movie made out of him because he was a very incredible person in Pasadena. He started for youth before the boys club, and most of the people were, Hispanic and African American. I went to Garfield Elementary School. I came here from Mexico in 1964. So, and actually grew up in the Cypress area. That I am glad that map was there, because it's very, very interesting how I saw it, because it really was, when I came to this country, that was the area that we lived in. And you're very right, Roberta. They would actually tell us not to speak Spanish even back then in 1965, 66, that you would get in trouble if you spoke Spanish at school. So your presentation is incredible. I like I say, I came here in 1964, but was raised all my life in Pasadena. It's a wonderful presentation. It's great to see that, Hispanics and Latinos had a lot to do with the making of Pasadena that I didn't know. Your presentation was fantastic, and I learned a lot, and kudos to you. And I'll go pick up your book. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. As important, much as I appreciate the picking up the book, one of the questions that was brought up before was, okay, so Pasadena Village, what might you do, relative to the 1619, since this is part of what this is about, is we need to have this history available.
Yes.
This should be a history as students are learning about Dr. Griffin and Jackie Robinson and Octavia Butler. They should be learning about these people, especially because our district is majority Latino. PCC is a Hispanic serving institute. Over 50% of the people that are attending there are Latine, Latinx. And yet we don't have this information out there. I have been doing these sorts of talks for 20 years.
Wow.
And right. And this should be something, it's not about me, quite frankly. It really is about getting this information out there. We have been made invisible because our history has not been included. There are a couple other presentations that I make that are talking about shared histories.
Very few
Because
members.
excuse me, whoever is talking, if you don't mind muting, please. Thank you. Is just these histories should be known by everybody. We do not have the Pasadena Museum of History has done wonderful work. And for a variety of reasons, we have a Black history collection in the museum. We don't have comparable for other groups. And part of that certainly is on the community, but it's also on the allies who are looking to find out about other community members who were here and about the shared experiences we've had together. The fact, for example, all honor to John Kennedy and the work that he did with the Northwest Commission to get the histories on the 10 West Walnut. But some of the information that's there is inaccurate relative to the Latino community. Again, that's not a reflection on John. I'm trying to say this is a wonderful thing that he did. But, if we have this information available, some of the mistakes that are made could be easily rectified or justified. Another thing in thinking about what Pasadena Village might do is we can put together, or I will put together, a bibliography, and we can share that with you. And I know that Brian put together a bibliography. And it might be that among the things as a group you might want to do is figure out some ways that you can put together bibliographies so that people can know some of these resources to go to. Yeah.
Yeah, Ben, Roberta, if you send me that bibliography, we can make that available so that it'll be available on the blog post that we'll write about this presentation. And then the recording will also be available on our website so that people can come back and look at it and go over it again and find the bibliography and see your presentation.
Well, that would be great. And how do we get this information to our kids is one of the questions that I've had for the last 15, 20 years. And that's where those of you that are feeling that you'd like to see this somehow or the other going to the kids, talk to your school board member, ask them as they're right. We're coming into election season. Ask them as they're going into elections, what are you going to do about sharing this history? Do you know about this history? How do we get it to the kids? And not just for the Latino kids, but for all kids to know. And so that kids can know also about our AAPI history that's here, our Japanese Americans. If you're talking about the Winona Cypress area, who were those Irish Americans that were there? What was their experience like? That's something that's kind of gotten lost. And that's part of who we are as a city. That's a part of our history, right?
Okay, great. Anybody have anything else they'd like to ask about or talk about? And Roberta, you want to take down your share screen now so we can see
I'm so
people's
sorry.
face? Yeah.
There
we go.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is Will Fuller. I now live in Portland, but our family lived in Altadena area for many years. We moved to LA with my stepfather, Paul Sheldon, who was an urban sociologist at Occidental College many years. And in the 50s, he was studying the Mexican American community in LA, which was almost unknown at the time. And his concern was at the time, politically, the Black community was pretty organized, but the Mexican American community was not. There were organizations fought each other and a whole bunch of bifurcation. Have things changed now? Is there a more organized Latinx community in the area?
Well, I think that there are bunches of little things that let me parse it a little bit apart. I think there was some argument that took place in different groups. I think sometimes when you're talking about the Latinx community, you're talking not only about Mexicanos or people who have a common experience. You're talking about people from El Salvador. You're talking about Argentina, folks from Argentina. You're talking about Cubanos, many of whom came here in the first wave of Cubanos to Florida. Were people who were very ardent Republicans, which are having a very different experience from those who are here in the Southwest, who are Chicanos, who are more informed by the CSO and the idea of union organizing. So you have that as an element that is a part of our community. The other part is, I think, the experiences are similar, perhaps more similar in the Black community than they are in the Latinx community going across different areas. And also, I think one of the things that I didn't talk about is that you have the issue of language. So part of the reason we don't have some of the history of the Latino community is some of the earliest documents that you can have access to are written in Spanish. Many of the people who were coming here were hardworking people who were not well educated. They may have been smart, They may have been diligent, they may have been hard workers, but they didn't have the advantage of schools. One of the things that I was struck by in listening to both Brian and Adrian, and Alma, who is a delight, is the idea that they were professionals that were coming here. And so part of what I think gets woven into this is not only ethnic, racial kinds of identities, but socioeconomic identities and skill sets. So the idea that, as an example, using my husband's side of the family, he was my husband's grandfather, Polish, from Poland, in Michigan. He wanted to be a foreman. His supervisor came to the back door and told him, Jan, they're not going to listen to you. You're Polish. It wasn't his Polishness as much as his immigrant status, right? And in that city, the Poles were not very strong politically. So I think there's a lot of elements that are there. I think the younger generation that's coming up that that's laughing at me when I'm bobbling around with screen share, I think they're going to be having a different approach to how they're moving ahead because they have more shared experiences. And I love Portland, and Portland has, I went to its first Dia de los Muertos about 10 years ago. So it's very interesting. And the whole history of the Pineros, the people that went up there that were Mexicanos that were working in the forests, that were working in lumber work, essentially, is an interesting story.
Yeah. There are parts of, I think the largest non-Anglo community in Portland area is Latino or Latinx. And there are certain areas down around, especially in the Willamette Valley, which of course is the Central Valley of Oregon, which because of farm labor has been majority Latino. I was driving down a street one day in Woodburn, and this woman in a parking lot with all these people, and there was Dolores Huerta organizing people in Woodburn.
Yes.
It's been a tradition in Oregon, yeah.
Yeah, well, and Dolores Huerta, because speaking of the parade, Dolores Huerta, when they were going to close down Washington School, there was a couple of us that went up to Bakersfield, brought her to Pasadena, and she spoke to the school board, which sadly did not know who she was. I mean, that's how disconnected they are. And I don't mean that to mock them. I just mean that is not something that they knew because it's not shared, it's not taught. So they didn't know who was speaking to them. And she was twice in our Latino Heritage Parade, 1 year as the Grand Marshal.
Wow.
Yeah, Dolores is still going.
Cool.
Be great to have something named after her here in Pasadena.
Yeah. Portland does have a Cesar Chavez Boulevard, among other things.
And a school, which is where my granddaughters went.
Oh, yes. Oh, cool.
Right, great. Well, going once, going twice, 3 times. Thank you very much, Roberta. This was wonderful. We will get this posted as soon as we're able to maneuver everything around, and it'll be available. And check back on our blog, on the 1619 blog on the Pasadena Village website, and you'll be able to see the link to the video